Well, welcome to episode 8 of the Afterword, our series of conversations on books, reading, and the church. Tonight we have a special Christmas episode for you with David Mathis, who's the executive editor at Desiring God. He's also the author of The Christmas We Didn't Expect, Daily Devotions for Advent that just released. By way of introduction to this episode, I wanted to read you a brief note from Kyle Whitgrove, who's our customer experience manager. You might have talked with Kyle over the phone or maybe seen him at a recent conference. But Kyle wrote this note to introduce a Christmas outreach promotion that we recently put together. I thought it was just really captured well this COVID Christmas that we're all experiencing. So let me read it to you now. Kyle says, "Over the weekend, my wife and I looked out the window to find our neighbors putting out Christmas lights and reindeer in shorts and t-shirts as unseasonably warm temperatures came through Philadelphia. As strict no Christmas until after Thanksgiving people, we would normally say something to each other about how this is way too early for Christmas decorations. But this year felt different. 2020 has been hard, and people are looking for something to look forward to. They are looking for light in the darkness. And while we're now glad that our neighbors have started decorating, it's a clear reminder to me that what is needed this year and every year is not just a few electric lights, but the brilliant light of the Savior of the world. This year, we've put together some of our favorite resources for sharing the light of Christ with a world in darkness. We hope these resources encourage and equip you to share the true hope of Christmas with your friends, family, neighbors, church visitors, and more." And I would encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to already, hop on over to our website at wtsbooks.com, and there you can find a lot of really great and affordable resources to hand out this Christmas, as well as David's new devotional and many other great things on sale right now through the end of November. So with that by introduction, let me hand it over to David and Jonny. Jonny, was Christmas something you always celebrated in your home growing up?
Yeah, Christmas was something we celebrated as a family. I was brought up in a Christian family, a missionary family, where we served in Tanzania, East Africa, for the first 7 years of my life. So it was a very simple Christmas, but it was still something we celebrated. And some Christmases we were home on furlough, and there was more festivities around those Christmases when we were back in the UK, in Northern Ireland. And then when we returned to live in Northern Ireland, yeah, Christmas every year became a big thing. We would go to church on Christmas morning, and then all the families would come together. My father's side, we would all get together with cousins and have a big meal on Christmas Day, and end the day watching James Bond or something like that, or Star Wars. So Christmas was something that we celebrated, but I wouldn't say it was done overly well, and we can maybe get into some of that. But yeah, it was definitely a day that we knew Christ was born, but there's a good bit of Santa thrown in there as well. So, what about you, David? What was Christmas like for you growing up?
I grew up in South Carolina, Southern Baptist, and my parents, I think they celebrated Christmas really well. I have so many good memories of Christmas, and perhaps that's why here I am all these years later, loving the Advent season and Christmas season enough to do meditations on it and put together a book on it, because it was a high time for us. I don't have any bad memories of Christmas growing up. I think as I've grown older, I'm able to see through the layers more, and I'm on no campaign against Santa or Frosty or Rudolph, but as a dad, I want to be really intentional that those things aren't at the center and they don't encroach on the center. And but I have loved the distinctiveness of the month of December, whether that was growing up in South Carolina, how my parents made it special. I mean, they did a great job going over the top and doing gifts. And we spent time with grandparents. We had grandparents nearby for
Yeah.
all of my childhood. And so we'd spend time with both sides. We'd have a family Christmas on Christmas Eve where we exchange gifts. And there was typically some part of there was something that church was doing either on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day around there, some kind of special service with choir music and candlelight and that sort of thing. And here's one memory. For Christmas, my mom would always make a big chocolate chip cookie. These birthday chocolate, the whole thing. You cut it up like a pizza.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's cheesy, but it made the point. Like, it was Happy Birthday Jesus.
Right.
So we always had the Happy Birthday Jesus cookie, at the center of our Christmas. And even though, I mean, as a kid, Santa loomed large for the gifts that were coming from Santa, but that was an important placeholder. And and we also did some Advent wreaths. We would light candles on the weekends, even though our home church didn't spend a lot of emphasis on those Advent Sundays leading up. We did some of that in our home.
Yeah.
And that kind of was a springboard for me in going into adulthood and wanting to make more of that Advent season.
Yeah. So the big question is, did Santa get any of Jesus's cookie?
No, I don't remember. I think Santa would always eat something else. I don't remember leaving out some of Jesus' cookie for Santa. I think those cookies that Mom made, they were so good that the six of us consumed that thing pretty easy.
Right. Very good. Very good. Yeah, we were the same. It was always a very happy occasion, but we didn't really do Advent. We did Christmas Day. We'd go to church as a family, but it was more a kids' talk in the morning. I just went to an independent evangelical church. It was a very stripped back service, and which would be a kids' talk really for the kids, and who would bring their toys to the front and show people what they'd got for Christmas. So I wasn't really brought up in a tradition, I would say, that was really rich with Advent or Christmas. We'd sing some Christmas carols the Sunday or so before Christmas Day. But it's only in more recent years where I've started to actually really appreciate this season of Advent. So you've written a daily devotional on not just for Christmas, but actually for the whole season of Advent. Do you want to just first help listeners understand what Advent actually is, how long it goes for, and why you think it's important to not just celebrate Christmas, but actually have the Advent season be a time of preparation for Christmas?
Yes, Advent is a season of waiting before Christmas. And so, back in the annals of church history, Advent is the fast before the feast of Christmas. And whereas maybe in our more modern culture, where there's a lot of emphasis on Christmas Day, and we kind of extend the whole of Christmas throughout December, in church tradition, there were the 12 days of Christmas, which we sing that silly song about. People don't know nowadays much what the 12 days of Christmas were, but the 12-day feast went from Christmas Day through Epiphany, January 6th. And leading up to that extended 12-day feast was the three and a half weeks of fasting before the feast, the season of waiting. And so Advent is the season of minor chords before the major chords of Christmas Day. If Christmas Day is joy to the world, Advent's theme song is more like O Come Emmanuel, where we rehearse with God's people from centuries ago what it was like to wait for the Messiah. I mean, you can go back to Genesis 3 and the promise of the seed of the woman who will crush the serpent. But then even back to King David, that's 1,000 years before Jesus came that King David is receiving those promises about this great heir to come, this great anointed one, singularly anointed. And then Isaiah, we read Isaiah at Christmas. Isaiah is so clear about this anointed one that is coming, this child that will be born. And that's 7 centuries before Jesus came. And then even Malachi, at the end of the Old Testament, 4 centuries. So God came about this thing with such remarkable patience. He overturned the wisdom and ways of us humans in just how patient he was in allowing history to unfold and bringing this climax of all history in his son. And so one thing we do in Advent, among many things, is we practice that habit of waiting. We cultivate patience. We wait on the coming of Messiah with God's people throughout history. And in doing so, there are joys and spiritual graces to us in that season of waiting. and there's an accenting of the feast. The feast is all the more glorious. The major chords sound all the better. The joys of Christmas are all the deeper and richer because of the fasting, the waiting that comes beforehand. And so, Advent, to define it more clearly, 4 Sundays before Christmas. So it's typically, 3.5 weeks coming up to Christmas. It's often, it's the end of November, early December when it begins, that fourth Sunday before Christmas. And so I just started the book on December 1, since it changes every year. So that's where the readings begin, December 1,
Yeah.
and go through the 24th, and kind of try to cover that Advent period.
Yeah. I like the distinction there between the waiting and the coming. I mean, Advent means the coming of Christ, but it's really a season of waiting for his coming.
Right.
And then there's his coming, and epiphany, meaning the appearance of the Christ. I think that those three distinctions are really nice. And as I said, I wasn't brought up with it. And so I always thought Advent was for the Catholics, the High Church Anglicans. But as I've started to get into the Reformed tradition a bit more, I've realized that actually there was quite a diversity even amongst Reformed churches in the 16th, 17th century. Some of them did actually follow the church calendar and kept Advent, so to speak. The thing I like about what you said there was two things. One came to mind was a quote from an old Bible teacher that my mother sat under in Liverpool, where she's from. And he said, God moved with majestic leisureliness through the Old Testament.
He did.
Beautiful phrase, majestic leisureliness. He was never in a rush. And I've always been struck that Jesus is never spoken of as running anywhere. He always walks,
That's right.
But I thought that sort of captured what your point was, that there's this waiting period, and perhaps in our modern culture we can't stand waiting. We get frustrated when someone hasn't replied the text message within 3 seconds.
Oh, that's right.
And so that it's a nice discipline, isn't it, to have that waiting period. But
it is. Maybe one thing what I want to cultivate here is in the hurricane of December. I mean, all the rush, all the hurry, all the distractions of December, that there would be an eye of the hurricane. There's a song at the end of the Hamilton musical about being in the eye of the hurricane. And I think that it's a good image for Christians as they come into December, and it's the most distinctive month of the year culturally, which is both an opportunity for us as Christians, and it's there's combat there. It's a diversion, a distraction. There's competition for our attention, and for us to live our Advent on the world's terms rather than on biblical terms. And so that's what I want to help people think about, and come to the Advent season thinking, I'm not going to let the clock of my soul be set by the pace of my society. I want to set my clock to the God who moves leisurely. And I hope that's one thing that will happen here, and a kind of eye of the hurricane for us as we live with sober-mindedness and intentionality in this run-up to Christmas.
Yeah, and I think a book that encourages meditation and pondering on these great truths of the coming of Christ and the incarnation is a really helpful way to get in the eye of the hurricane, and settle down and calm down and remember what this season is all about. Well, the big question then is you're a pastor of a church and a Christian husband and father. Do you read nativity passages before Christmas? Do you sing carols early December, or do you sing more Advent hymns? I've started to appreciate there's a distinction. Hark the Herald Angels Sing is really a song for Christmas morning.
That's right. Yeah.
Whereas O Come, Emmanuel is a song for Advent. So
That's
you, as a family and as a pastor, do you try and have that kind of distinction in liturgy reading, in your liturgy at home or in church, with readings, with singing?
Yeah, this is something that we are growing in as a church. And so with each year, I think maybe the previous year informs us, and perhaps we move another degree back toward how Christians have done this over the long term. So I'm not on a personal crusade to implement a really strong framework that others have to do it that way, and same as our church. But we're learning from the church tradition, and I think every year we like it a little bit more in terms of thinking, all right, not just Christmas Day. We like this pattern of 3.5 weeks of meditative, careful, reflective preparation, waiting, fasting before the feasting, and then extending that Christmas. I mean, it's unusual to do that. I don't know that somebody can just do it well one year all of a sudden. And so we kind of see ourselves in the process of that. One of the ways that we do it as a church that's pretty conspicuous is we change our corporate call to worship throughout the various seasons of the church calendar. And so our Advent call to worship is what's the it's been a year since I know the Christmas one. The Christmas one is Christ has come.
Oh yeah.
And then the congregation says Christ will come again. And so in that way, we're celebrating the Christmas season of He's come. And before Advent, during the Advent season, we're waiting on the coming. We're rehearsing the time where God's people waited for God Himself to come in the person of His Son. And so we do that a little bit as a family. Well, I've got young kids. So last year, the way we did it is we had a verse each day. I just kind of set up a verse each day that were about the coming of Christ or about the person of Christ. So kind of a Christological focus. Whereas maybe there's a little more soteriological focus around the Easter time, kind of on the work of Christ. And thinking of Christmas as a time to focus on the person of Christ. And so texts like Hebrews 1:1-4, or the big Colossians 1:1-15, Colossians 2:9, Philippians 2:5-9. Some of those texts are real strong Christological texts. John 1:14, John 1:1-3. And we would take a verse a day. I'd read it to the kids, and I'd give them Daddy's 30 to 60 second explanation of why this text is important and awesome. And then we'd all eat a chocolate together. And then we'd hold it up. We'd hold up the chocolate and say, Christ has come. And we say, Christ has come again. Eat the chocolate. So that was my effort to try to engage the kids in kind of Advent season pattern. And we'll talk about that at church. I mean, a significant thing for me, when I moved to Minnesota in 2003, I came to a church, Bethlehem Baptist, that was serious about Advent. I mean, the services in December looked different. Piper would write an Advent poem.
That's
it was
right.
amazing. He wrote these Advent poems, and he would get up and read this long poem, and then one of the kids of the church would have like a white gown on and would walk down with the candle, with the fire, and then light the Advent candle. So it was a big deal in our services. And that had a shaping effect on me. And we do something similar. None of us at our church write Advent poems, but we do have one of the children of the church proceed down. The congregation is silent and still. We watch the light come. The candle is lit. We change the call to worship. And I think over time, there's been more of the Advent songs throughout December, and then really celebrating with the major keys, the Hark the Herald Angels, the Joy to the World, in that 12-day period from Christmas Day through January 6th.
Yeah, I think it's very rich. I've started to appreciate it a lot more, singing Advent hymns like Behold a Rose There Blooming, 1599 German hymn.
Wow.
And it takes you through Isaiah's prophecy of a rose, a tree, a branch that would grow. And then it finally gets to Christ with Mary. And these Advent hymns are actually very rich, and they're for a certain time, to be sung before Christmas. And then the Christmas hymns sung actually at Christmas, or at least around that Christmas week. So the question I wanted to ask then is, do you keep Epiphany? Because the reason I ask is my son, I'm a Reformed Presbyterian. I would probably say a high church Presbyterian, because I like keeping certain seasons like Advent and Christmas. My son goes to a Reformed Episcopal school, and so they have to attend Epiphany Sunday as part of their school calendar. And I've started to really appreciate this, that actually the tradition I was brought up in, and this is what I meant earlier when I said I didn't think we did Christmas overly well. My family did it well. It was always a happy time. But Boxing Day, it was over. It was
Yeah,
just
that's
done.
right.
We were done. It was like, right, New Year, and then Easter's the next thing. But this school tradition that my son's in, it's just sort of helped me appreciate that if we really believe in Advent is the waiting for the coming, and Christmas is the coming, well then why not have 2 more Sundays on the appearing?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you would read the nativity passages, and you'd really reflect then on the incarnation and the wonder that God has become flesh in Christ. Do you do that with family or church, the Epiphany season, these 12 days of Christmas?
We are growing in that as a church. So that is something we are doing as a church and marking that. Like we distinctively have, and people have said how strange it is, to come to church on December 28th or 29th or January 2nd. Like, you guys are singing Christmas songs. Like, weren't you supposed to shut that down on the 25th? And we're like, no. Like, this is the time. Like, those songs are written for the 12-day period here. And actually, you mentioned earlier about the Catholic Church, and as you said that kind of unrolled a layer in my mind of why I would be such a strange person and do an Advent book. I went to Catholic school growing up.
Right.
So I hope your Reformed listeners don't hold that against me. I was a happy Baptist the whole time, and I'm happily Reformed. But that shaped me. In fact, that we talked about Epiphany. Like, from the time I was a little kid, I heard from the Catholics at school about Epiphany, and we talked about the Magi coming, and we marked that, and we kind of distinguished. We celebrated the right around Christmas. We'd mention the shepherds and probably do Luke's narrative, and then we'd hold off on Matthew's narrative to be celebrated closer to the 6th, to the Epiphany, and so that may have shaped me early on too. Spring loaded me for when I came to Bethlehem, and we started making much of Advent for some of that to be drawn out. So I do think culturally we are so impatient that we turn the corner at Thanksgiving, and then it's like, well, let's just enjoy all the Christmas goodies right now. Like, get the Frosty cartoon on and all the Santa Claus movies. And so we're trying to pound all of the Christmas joy into the early part of the season there. Yeah. And a lot of us are just tired out. We're done with Christmas by about December 15 or 17 or 18. And I do like this pattern. I want to cultivate this more and more of, all right, let's go through this spiritual discipline, this rhythm of waiting and patience. And as we wait on the coming of Christmas, our enjoyment of it's going to be all the greater in that season of those 12 days.
Yeah. And, in the tradition I'm now in, the Reformed Presbyterian, there's some who would say you don't celebrate any of these feast days or holy days, and that's fine. I actually have respect for people who say, right, we just don't do Christmas. It's more the people who say, well, we have a Christmas sermon, and we'll sing some carols, but that's all we do. We don't want to get into it. And part of me thinks, well, no, if you're either in it or you're not, and I think if you're going to do it, which most people do, most churches do have a Christmas service, and my view is, well, if you're going to do it well. Do Advent and preach Old Testament passages of the coming of Christ and sing Advent hymns, and then Christmas Day will be richer. And then why not spend 2 more weeks preaching through the nativity passages where you can really unpack the riches of the incarnation and the appearing of Christ. So I think what I've learned is that there's a way to do it that really enriches it, rather than just do it piecemeal. And actually starting to read more of the Reformed liturgies, you see that actually more of the Reformers did the church calendar than we realize. I don't know if you're familiar with Danny Hyde's article called "Not Holy but Helpful."
Interesting.
For the evangelical feast days in the Reformed tradition. So perhaps for the listeners out there, you can Google it. It's online. Not holy but helpful. And he basically shows that there were these 5 evangelical feast days: Christmas, Good Friday, Easter Sunday, Ascension, and Pentecost. And there was a diversity of practice and in the Reformed tradition of keeping some of those days. And it sort of helps you see that it's not actually the Catholics who have it all. It's actually some of the reformers have followed these. Now, before we get on to your book, David, what do you do for Easter, and do you keep Ascension and Pentecost? Are those in your church calendar or family devotions?
Yeah, I guess the full disclosure would be Christmas and Easter and Good Friday, Holy Week, Advent. We do those really well.
Yeah.
a lot of emphasis there. I think it's growing in how we integrate Epiphany,
Yeah.
Ascension, and then Pentecost. I think probably Pentecost is the one who's gotten the least attention in our church, in our family. Maybe Ascension after Easter and Good Friday. Maybe Ascension would be next, and then Epiphany, and then Pentecost, the least at this point. But I do love that pattern. Another thing I picked up at Bethlehem is Bethlehem was really serious about Holy Week, which was awesome. And we try to do that as well. That there's some mention on that Sunday. I don't know that we've done the kids with the palm branches, but on Palm Sunday, usually some mention there. We'll have some. We'll usually make some devotional literature kind of available to the congregation. Yeah. And encourage people to make it a week of extra meditation and thoughtfulness if they choose to do so. And then we often had either a Maundy Thursday service or a Good Friday service, and then celebrate well on Easter. And there's a similar pattern there. There's a Holy Week leading up to that Easter Sunday. And in some sense, backing the whole thing out, some people celebrate Lent leading all the way up to the Holy Week and Easter Sunday. But there's a similar pattern there in terms of anticipating the feast.
Yes. And, as Christians, we celebrate the Lord's incarnation, life, death, resurrection, ascension, Pentecost every Sunday.
Yes.
Every Lord's Day, that's what we're celebrating, the gospel. But just like we would do a sermon series on the incarnation, or a sermon series on the life of Christ, or the death of Christ, or the resurrection, or the ascension, I think it's helpful to have seasons and times in a church calendar where you focus on these. And I think it can be helpful to just acknowledge that, there is this church calendar, and most churches, as I said, do at least a sermon on Easter Sunday about the resurrection or Christmas. Right. So it's not a bad thing to realize. Actually, you could educate your church and inform your people well around that time when everyone's talking about Easter or Christmas on the great doctrine of the incarnation or the resurrection. So it's a time for catechesis, really, as well. It's a time to really inform the church as a pastor and build up the congregation about great doctrinal truths, which you can connect to certain seasons in the year.
That's right. Yeah, there's been some years where we set December aside for an Advent series. And so we did this a few years ago. We went through Luke 1 and 2. Just did a short 4-week exegetical series through Luke 1 and 2 leading up to Christmas. And there's been other times where we're finishing the series of the fall. So right now we're getting close to the end of 2 Timothy. I had to preach the word passage yesterday. So we got one more left in 2 Timothy, and then we're scheduled to have Titus. And I think that goes up to Christmas. And so what we'll do is we'll think through how to, in the exposition of Titus, which for this year, we've got it running through December, how we're going to accent some of those themes. And there's other parts of the service too. I mean, we do a little section that we call the exhortation early in the service, where somebody comes up and one of the elders or one of the pastors in training will give an exhortation to the congregation. And those are often times to really accent what's going on in the church life without giving the whole of the sermon to it. We can keep the sermon on the exposition series, and then the exhortation can be really flexible to kind of speak into the moment of the life of the church or the culture.
Yeah, that's nice. I always like to think of the church service, the canvas of the church service is bigger, larger than the canvas of the sermon.
Yes.
Whereas church services where everything's about the sermon, the opening call to worship, the opening hymn, every hymn before the sermon, the hymn after, it's all about the sermon. It just lacks a diversity and a richness and a breadth, and it just becomes all very samey, whereas actually if you can have Old Testament readings that aren't necessarily um, connected to the sermon. They're just you're reading through the Old Testament, or you're singing hymns about creation and the Trinity at the beginning. That's not actually about the sermon. It still just shows you that God's bigger than just this one passage that you're looking at. Okay,
it's all the context of corporate worship, and I think it's
yeah,
without minimizing at all the importance of the preached word.
yeah,
For us as a pastor, as the preacher, to bring the kind of honesty and humility to it, that this is in the context of corporate worship, and we're all walking through this together. This is not just, hey, I'm here for my 30-minute sermon. Here's what really matters. But the whole service together, this is what we are leading in as pastors and as God's people in coming to worship.
Yeah, and it helps people stop thinking that really you're here for a Bible talk and there's a wee bit of singing and a prayer before it.
That's
but
right.
we're here for the Bible talk.
Yeah,
I'm always struck
worship.
I'm always struck that Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, in writing the Book of Common Prayer, called it the service of the word, not the service of the sermon. There was more word parts to it than just the sermon. There was Bible readings, the gospel reading, the epistle reading, and then there was the sermon.
Yes.
So it was the service of the word, not just the service of the sermon. So
that's good. Yeah, we like to think through that dynamic of, in corporate worship, we as a people hear from God and we respond back to God. There's this relationship, this interaction. Like we hear from him in his word and we respond back in our prayers.
Yeah.
In our singing.
Yeah. Well, let's get on to this book, delightful little book you've written called The Christmas We Didn't Expect. Did you put that title in because of COVID 2020, or is this a title that you already had in mind?
Well, actually, I mean, this is a title we had a year ago when COVID was very unexpected. The Good Book Company noticed that I had a particular fancy for Advent, and that I would write these Advent meditations each year at Desiring God. And so they approached me and said, hey, we're doing an Advent. We like to do Advent books. And would you do our Advent book for 2020? This is a few years ago. And so in thinking through, it's like, all right, do I have enough to say for 24 days of meditations? Is it going to get old? And so I started reviewing some of the meditations I'd done in the past on Advent, or some Christmas sermons, just thinking what was there. And I noticed this word jumped out at me that I had used over and over in these meditations about unexpected. So I thought, you know what, maybe that's what holds this together for me. One thing that God has impressed on me in my situation, scenario, whatever it is over the years, is how unexpected the whole thing is. Like an unwed mother. You don't expect that. I mean, the blue collar shepherds coming, magi. Like we get our word magic from the magi. I mean, pagan astrologers coming, while the religious dignitaries in Jerusalem don't make the relatively short 5-mile journey down to see the one that they think is the fulfillment of Isaiah or the Micah prophecy. At least they say that to Herod. So there are so many unexpected dynamics. And I thought, you know what? That probably holds it together for me. And so I offered this up as a possibility. The Christmas we didn't expect. And the Good Book Company said, they were willing to work with me on that. So that was decided, I think, back in 2019. And I don't know when it was, sometime long about the spring or summer, when I realized, you know what, this is probably going to be an unusual Christmas, an unexpected Christmas. And so maybe there's some overlap there, and maybe this would be a good year to emphasize and to rehearse that theme of how unexpected the whole thing was, as some of us maybe go through a Christmas that we weren't expecting, at least as of last year, or at least a Christmas that's unusual from what we've grown accustomed to during the course of our lives.
Yeah. Well, look, even as a cessationist, I'm prepared to say that it was somewhat prophetic for you to come up with a title like that. But I like that about the book. You have this theme of unexpectedness, surprise, that goes through an unexpected birth, and then you have 3 chapters, the unexpected child, 3 chapters, unexpected news, unexpected guests, unexpected time, unexpected joy, our unexpected part, and that unexpected day. So I think it's really helpful, sort of unifying theme there. And then you group different parts together. The other thing struck me was you've been very thoughtful to ordinary Christians living busy lives. It's just 5 pages, a chapter with a nice short prayer at the end, which I thought was really helpful. I don't know if you know the story of Winston Churchill, who got up to speak, and he said he spoke for 40 minutes, and he said, "I'm so sorry, I've spoken for so long. I didn't have much time to prepare a shorter message."
Yep.
So what was this like writing for you? Are you naturally a pithy, short writer? Can you keep things short, or are you verbose and it takes quite a while to edit it down to 5 pages a chapter?
Yeah, Johnny, maybe you've got a similar experience to me, but the older I get, the harder it is to keep it short.
Yeah.
And so one sermon after another, I am, thinking, all right, this one's going to be 2,500 words. And the next thing I do, I look up and it's 3,300. And the hardest work is the cutting. And so nowadays, when I sit down to write, it is often in a 12 at least or 1,500 word arc. And maybe my editor buddies here at Desiring God would say, only 1,500, usually writing 2,200. So the hardest work was paring it down. And my editor, Rachel, at the Good Book Company, she was really good. Like, we're going to keep all these under 1,000 words. A lot of these are close to 900 words. And so she kept pressing me to shorten. She helped shorten some of them. And I think at the end, that is the hardest work. I really resonate with Churchill's statement. Yeah. And when I talk to guys about preaching, which I got to go here in a few minutes and help out with a preaching class, that's one of the things I love emphasizing is, guys, you have been through seminary. The longer you read the Bible, the longer you think about issues, it is very easy to talk for 60 minutes. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to talk for only 25. Mm-hmm. And let's put in the extra work. Let's keep challenging each other on this. And there are also times to just teach for a long time in the appropriate setting. But I really do resonate with the Churchill quote.
Yeah. No, and I think it's really helpful book that any Christian can pick up and read and enjoy it and not feel overwhelmed by it. It's very deep, and you go into some very profound aspects of the coming of Christ and the incarnation. And yet you've done a really good job of keeping it short, or at least Rachel helped you.
That's right, she did.
Yeah, it's like my wife when I'm preaching. She listens. She says, "Nah, about 10 minutes too long. I could have taken it out." And I always say, "Yeah, but the 10 minutes were the best bit. The extra 10 minutes were the best."
I try to tell guys in the preaching class, you want to finish about 5 minutes shorter than expected. And so it'd be so good if the audience is thinking, "Oh, I want more. I can't wait till next Sunday."
Yeah.
But you know what? That is so hard. That's really difficult. Those cuts are challenging.
Yeah. Now, you have in here unexpected joy, which is not unexpected, since you work for Desiring God and have been influenced by John Piper, who is all about joy and Christian hedonism. But what I did like is within that section, Unexpected Joy, you had a chapter called Christmas Doesn't Ignore Your Pain. And Christmas for many Christians, and it's the same in my family, it's a time when somebody's not present.
Right.
For us, it's a daughter called Layla, who very sadly died 4 years ago. And we put on our Christmas tree 2 little ornaments that say Layla, and it's our time. She didn't die at Christmas. She died in the spring near Easter. But Christmas is actually the time, apart from the week of her death, where we remember her each year, but Christmas is actually a time besides that week that we feel the pain of her death the most. And we love to sing, "O come, come, Emmanuel," dispel the dark night, dispel the death away from the earth. I've just forgotten those words. But I like that you put that into this book. So what is it you're trying to communicate to people in that chapter about Christmas doesn't ignore your pain?
Well, there's so many of the songs, and they're typically not Christmas songs, Christian Christmas songs, but just secular songs about it's the most wonderful time. Everything's all is merry and bright. And so culturally, there can be this impression that Christmas is just this comfortable, cozy, everything's bright, everything's happy, and in missing Advent, there may be a relationship there in missing Advent, and that's part of the unexpected nature, especially for us as modern people, with the true Christmas. Like, not all was merry and bright. It was a mess in some sense. I mean, an unwed mother in a small town. Can you imagine how that got around town? Can you imagine how crazy this was for Joseph, thinking that his fiance, who he's betrothed to, has been unfaithful, and then the disorientation of the census and having to go to Bethlehem with somebody who's on the cusp of having a child, and then the fact that there aren't the expected people coming to visit, and there's not room in some way, and so he's laid in a manger. I mean, from beginning to end, this is a very unusual time. There are pains involved here. One that really sticks out, I mean, the slaughter of the infants is, of course, the most horrific and the worst aspect, and that seems to come along later through Herod, as you kind of put the timeline together when the Magi would have come. But even close to Christmas there in the Gospel of Luke, you have Simeon's prophecy, where, I mean, he says to Mary with this beautiful child in her arms that a sword will pierce your soul also. And so for her to hear at that seemingly happy moment that her soul's going to be pierced, and then she thinks, wait, me also? He's going to be pierced? He came to die? And so, we sing, "What child is this?" Nails, spear will pierce him through. And if we're taking our bearings from society, we may think, oh, no, holly jolly Christmas. Like, let's not talk about nails and spear. Like, we can save that for Good Friday. We can save that for the Holy Week. But it belongs in Christmas. I mean, as a child, when I did not get this, maybe "What Child Is This" was my least favorite song in December. Because all the adults are singing, "What child is this?" And I'm like, we all know what child it is. I didn't understand rhetorical questions. And then it was so odd. Like, let's not pierce the joy of Christmas with nails and spear and pain. But that is exactly why Christ came, because this is a world of pain, because this is a world of nails, a world of spears. And so when we have a pain that we bring to Christmas, God's bringing us in from the right angle of approach. So if you're coming up on this Christmas, and it's COVID Christmas, and there's going to be a loved one who's not there for the first time, or if you're, like your situation, Jonny, thinking of Layla, and I think it's very appropriate time to rehearse those who aren't there with you. Christmas can handle that pain. That pain does not detract from what the season is. If anything, it makes it more real. Because those are the kind of pains that Christ came to remedy, and he is coming back to finally vanish and vanquish. So Christmas is an appropriate time. Don't hide your pain at Christmas. Christmas can handle it.
Yeah. And it's really the tension, isn't it, between the first coming of Christ and the second coming. Christmas in many ways is bittersweet for Christ. He's born to die. But it's his second coming, which is triumphant, the resurrection of the dead, no more death, wipe away every tear. And we live between those two comings of Christ. And Christmas is the first coming, the Advent, and we're waiting for the second Advent, the parousia, the coming of Christ. And we live between that with death's dark shadows. And that's the hymn, "O come, Emmanuel," the second verse, and death's dark shadows put to flight.
Yes.
And he comes, and he does that himself in his first coming with his life, death, resurrection, ascension. But it's not yet for us. We're still living under death's dark shadows. But I think Christmas is the answer to those, as you said. It actually is the answer to our pain. And therefore we should embrace everything that Christmas is.
That's right.
I think it was C.S. Lewis who said Christmas is the meaning behind everything. And in a sense, we can also say it's the answer to everything. The incarnation doesn't save us, but it is the beginning of our salvation in Christ's coming. And so those are rich thoughts for us, David. Is there any Christmas carol or hymn that is one of your favorites that you think really captures Advent hymn or season, and then Christmas for you?
Well, I mean, I don't know that in terms of my own conception of Advent as a season for waiting, minor chords, O Come, O Come Emmanuel captures it so well. I mean,
Yeah,
it's almost like the paradigmatic Advent song.
yeah,
Uh, I do love Hark.
yeah,
And one of the chapters in the book celebrates Hark, some of the theology in there, and actually stumbling upon a couple long lost verses
uh-huh,
of Hark.
yeah, yeah,
Charles Wesley's original had some extra verses that somewhere, as it was popularized, got dropped. And then even this, George Whitefield, the famous evangelist, did some revisions on Charles Wesley's original. It's kind of a fascinating story. And so I love the line, veiled in flesh, the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity. That's one of my favorite Christmas lines. And then I mentioned from What Child Is This? Nail, spear will pierce him through. That's one of my favorite lines to sing in Advent and at Christmas.
yeah. I think I know where I worship, we sing good theology each week. It's good hymns that we sing the Psalms. But there's something about the Christmas hymns. I always turn to my wife and say, there's something incredibly rich about this. I don't know if my senses are heightened because it's Christmas and I'm feeling festive and all of that, but there's something really quite profound, I think, about many of the Advent and Christmas carols that give us a really rich insight into the doctrine of the gospel and the mystery, the surprise, the unexpectedness of God becoming flesh among us. I think it's really wonderful. So,
reflecting on that a little bit here recently, and in the prologue to the Gospel of John, like we think of the incarnation, and yet, this is some of the highest theology in the New Testament. And Word became flesh in 1:14, and then we get this statement at the end of verse 18. He has made the Father known. So at Christmas, in the coming of Christ, fully God, fully man, in one spectacular person, we don't just get to know Jesus at Christmas. Like we get to know the Father. We get to know the Godhead as manifested in Jesus. He is making the Father known. And so there are profound angles of sight into the very nature of who God is. It's not like, oh, God's one way, and by accident or concession, he did Christmas. But God is showing us himself for his people, those who are his by faith. We are seeing the heart of our Father on display in the gift of his Son at Christmas. And so there is a world of life and theology in Christmas to be seen.
Yeah. You have a chapter at the very end. It's the epilogue called The Permanence of Christmas. It took me back to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe with C.S. Lewis, where before Aslan comes, they say it's always winter, never Christmas.
Yeah.
And then Aslan appears, and it's like it's Christmas, and it's now permanently Christmas because Aslan has come. What is it you're trying to communicate in that chapter on the permanence of Christmas?
That's about the ongoing incarnation. And it can be very easy to think, if you haven't thought through it and you haven't been informed by a few texts of Scripture, sometimes people may think, at the ascension that Jesus dropped his human body. So now he's now God only back in heaven. That's not the case. Christ became human, and his humanity endures forever. It's an amazing thing that the second person of the Trinity, without emptying himself of any divinity, he didn't become any less God. He added humanity to his person, and forever he will be human like us. He has become our brother spectacularly. And so he has now a glorified body. He has a transformed human body. But at God's right hand, wherever this is spatially, at God's right hand is man, fully God and fully man. And the destiny that it speaks to for us as humans. Angels long to look in these things. The second person of the Trinity didn't become an angel to save angels. He became a human to save humans. And his body, he rose again bodily, and his body has been glorified. And that's the glorious body that we too will one day have, according to Philippians 3:20 and 21. And so that chapter is just a celebration of the ongoing humanity of Christ.
Yeah. As I was reading it, I thought of the hymn "Crown Him with Many Crowns" and the line, "Those wounds yet visible above,
Yes.
in beauty glorified." And I thought
Yeah.
that really captured what you were
Yes.
getting at. Was we will see the scars of Christ's body in heaven, but they will be in beauty glorified. But we will still see them and know
Mhm.
why they're there. So
I think that's my favorite all-time hymn, Johnny.
yeah, yeah. There you go. Well, that's a nice point to maybe start to bring this to a close. I think this is a wonderful book, David. I hope it is read widely by Christians, by families, by individuals. It's called the Christmas We Didn't Expect, and if you're listening, I would really encourage you to get a hold of it and enjoy this Advent season through new eyes this year, especially in the middle of COVID 2020. David, I wanted to ask, have you any more books in the pipeline that you hope to write in the future?
Yes, I'm working on one now, due at the end of the year, on eldership. This has been my assignment now for about 10 years at Bethlehem College and Seminary. I teach the eldership class. And one thing I found really helpful over the years is how illuminating it can be to take those qualifications from 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 with utter seriousness as not only the requisites of what elders need to become elders, pastors, but also the kind of person you need to be day in and day out to do the work as assigned. So I think there are worlds to be seen in those qualifications. In one sense, they're ad hoc and the list is incomplete, but in another sense, Paul's not just writing these off the cuff. I mean, the overlap in the lists, he really means it. And these character attributes are significant in the everyday work of eldering. And so I'm kind of organizing a book on eldering in light of the qualifications, really making the most of the qualifications as lenses into the task of eldering. And then eventually, this is for a couple years from now, the Good Book Company seemed happy with how the Advent book turned out. And so we're working on a Lent book for, I think, is that for Lent 2022?
Okay.
So a year and a half or so from now, I'll start working on that in the spring and try to get that together. And that one will be more focused on the work of Christ. So whereas this one is more on the person of Christ, Christology, that one will be more focused on the work of Christ.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to both of those coming out, Lord willing, in due course. And wish you God's richest blessings on your reading and writing.
Thank you, brother.
Also, in your ministry at Desiring God, I know I benefit greatly from reading the blogs and listening to some of the podcasts that you put out. And we can only encourage you as a ministry to keep doing it, because I know many, many people are blessed by it across the world. So thank you.